to go. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this session on consumer vulnerability, adopting an inclusive service approach. My name is Piera Johnson, Standards Development Manager at BSI, and I'm going to talk briefly about consumer vulnerability and the international standard that can help support it. Following this, Judith Turner, Deputy Chief Ombudsman for Dispute Resolution, will give a presentation on the subject. And after that, we'll answer any questions, and please pop them in the chat box. So, what is consumer vulnerability? Consumer vulnerability is defined as a state in which an individual can be placed at risk of harm during their interaction with a service provider due to the presence of personal, situational, and market environment factors. Vulnerability can affect anyone at any time. All consumers are different, with a wide range of needs, personal characteristics, health, abilities, and skills. Consumer vulnerability can be permanent, temporary or intermittent, long or short term, and can include, for example, bereavement, health conditions, and job loss. A consumer's needs can also change over time. The COVID-19 pandemic created new vulnerabilities and conditions that often exacerbated existing ones. And now we have the cost of living crisis to add to the mix. To help organisations provide the best service for their vulnerable consumers, BSI has recently published a new international standard, ISO 22458, Consumer Vulnerability Requirements and Guidelines for the Design and Delivery of Inclusive Service. It's a standard that's applicable to all organisations that provide services to consumers, and it can help businesses design fair, flexible, and inclusive services that will increase positive outcomes for consumers in vulnerable situations and minimise the risk of harm, ultimately improving the quality of their service provision as a whole. ISO 22458 is based on a British standard, BS 18477, Inclusive Service Provision, first published in 2010. It was a pioneering standard, but because the concept was new, not many businesses understood or took it up. It took a few years to take off, with the utilities sector amongst the first to adopt it. And with growing global interest in the area, BS 18477 was put forward in 2017 to become an ISO. 16 countries participated in its development, including Australia, Malaysia, Canada, Singapore, Japan, Germany, Italy, Norway, Uganda, and China, and it was published in April this year. So the interest in the subject is truly wide-reaching. I'd now like to hand over to Judith, who will talk about her experience of implementing a customer vulnerability strategy in her organisation and the challenges faced by businesses who participate in the Ombudsman in terms of complaint handling, as well as learning lessons from these in terms of consumer vulnerability. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much. So as Piera said, my name is Judith Turner. I am Deputy Chief Ombudsman at an organisation called Dispute Resolution Ombudsman. And by way of a little bit of background, we look at individual consumer complaints across various sectors, including the furniture and home improvement sector in the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman, more generally across consumer service sectors in our Dispute Resolution Ombudsman scheme, and also across the rail sector as well in the Rail Ombudsman. So in a way, I come at this from the complaints perspective, as in learning from complaints and how to implement that as part of the broader discussion, specifically referencing vulnerable consumers today. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which we did test and it did work. So hopefully everybody can now see my screen. I'm going to just talk through some of the examples and some of the issues that we see from a complaints perspective and from an ombudsman's perspective. So if I can move down. So in the context of the standard, as Piera denoted, it's incorporating fair, flexible and inclusive services for all. So an element of inclusive design in that. And in the context of the Ombudsman, this comes at the end of the process. and it's an important instrument in free access to justice via easy to navigate processes and channels, enabling businesses to learn from complaints. So it reduces the likelihood of problems, as the standard says, reduces the cost of complaints, have empowered and engaged staff, and most importantly, an improved customer experience. So how do we achieve all that in the context of learning from complaints and meaningful support for vulnerable consumers? So in terms of what the Ombudsman is, I'll just give you a little bit of background as to the Ombudsman and an introduction to an Ombudsman more broadly. So an Ombudsman has a role and remit that is based in complaint handling. So we have access to justice via our schemes through alternative dispute resolution. An alternative dispute resolution is a mechanism by which consumers, in the context of what I do, consumers can have access to a free alternative to going to court, to taking a business to court. So the Ombudsman will look at a case in front of it and decide on the basis of that case whether the consumer has an entitlement, for example. And in terms of what we're talking about today, it's really important, and just looking at that individual case before I broaden that out to the other aspect of ombudsmanry, it's really important in that case to note a few things about our processes and how we are accessible for people who are vulnerable. So we are free to consumers. So the consumer doesn't pay to access alternative dispute resolution when they come to an ombudsman. So that's quite an important factor, particularly in the context of the cost of living crisis that was referenced in the introduction. Our processes also have to be accessible, and as Piera indicated, we've also been on a journey to ensure that our processes are as accessible as possible, and part of that is in the way that we are set up. We have to be accessible because, for example, the ADR regulations say that our process has to be accessible in a number of means, including non-digital, so that we are available to people who are, for example, digitally excluded, which can also form part of the vulnerability. So our processes, in order for people to access justice effectively, have to be able to encompass that in terms of alternative dispute resolution, because we are an alternative to the court. We also, though, have an approach to flexible remedies. So whereas a court might have regards to legal remedies, we have a broader remit in terms of those flexible remedies that can be based in fairness. And I'm going to provide some examples of those towards the end of the presentation. So we have multiple communication channels, friendly professional staff, and we are there to help guide people through the process. So an ombudsman takes an inquisitorial approach, for example, to evidence gathering, which means that they don't necessarily just go on the evidence that's presented at the first point of contact from either party, actually, but potentially more so for consumers. We'll guide them through what evidence we need in order for them to establish their case, or not, as the case may be. But we'll tell them what we need, and we'll do that throughout the process, and that can be really, really important for people who might not otherwise have the means to take cases to court, for example, or who are daunted by that court process. So we take that inquisitorial approach to evidence gathering. We help the parties through the process. But an ombudsman has a broader remit than just the case in front of it, and that really forms the majority of what I'll be talking about for the rest of the session. So, for example, we have a broad access to data from our cases as a starting point. So we can look back through the cases that a business, for example, has had brought against them to the ombudsman, and we can determine whether they potentially have issues, or whether they whether there might be something there that's showing more broader systemic issues potentially. And that's part of that kind of broader remit of the Ombudsman that I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about now. I'm going to come off screen sharing for a moment so that I can see the room a little bit clearer, and I'll go back to the slides in a moment. So talking about that broader remit of the Ombudsman, so we can use data, for example, as a means of tracking trends and providing feedback to businesses about individual cases and more broadly what issues they might have. And that feeds into their processes in terms of assessing potential vulnerabilities, assessing issues that businesses might have more broadly. So whilst we do look at the kind of the legal remedies in terms of the ADR, we have that broader remit for consumers as well. So that they benefit from basically hearing about what's happened in other cases, and businesses can track trends and potentially put things right. So in terms of inclusive policies, one of the things that we challenge businesses, and I'll go back to sharing my screen to talk you through this, we challenge businesses to look at their own processes as part of their journey with the Ombudsman, because they get access to that broader case data and lessons learned from not only their own cases, but also cases that have been brought, across similar sectors, for example. So in terms of reaching the consumer, we kind of challenge businesses to make sure that their policies are inclusive. And as part of that, we would look at the whole process, so from start to finish, and we're able to assist with that through some of the information that we get from the case data. So for example, taking time to talk to me, reviewing processes and making sure that they have time to listen. One of the things that we put in place as an Ombudsman is what we call an introductory call. And we think it's really, really important when a consumer comes with a story to tell, because all of the cases are based in individual circumstances and individual stories, that we have the wherewithal to listen to them. So to hear them and to let them tell their story in their own words, and that can be really, really important for people who are vulnerable as well. Probably more so in terms of being able to put their point across and make sure that they have been understood. Filling in a form, for example, might not get everything across that you need to get across. You might not know what's missing. So the Ombudsman can listen to the complaint, can understand what's driving it, and can make sure that the parties, particularly the consumer, feels heard. And that can be even more important when people are potentially vulnerable or find themselves in vulnerable circumstances. And as we know, there are lots of different ways that can manifest. So making sure that processes are fully inclusive and that everybody gets that opportunity is really important. Treating every person as an individual, and I've got there on the slide that no two claims are the same. And we know, for example, taking examples from the rail sector, that we could all be travelling on a train this afternoon, and we could all be subject to the same delay or an incident while travelling on the rail network, and that would have a different impact on each of us individually. Somebody might be late for a meeting, somebody might miss a flight, someone might have a hidden disability, and they're finding themselves in a position where they're feeling anxious. So making sure that we take that time to listen and that we treat every case as individual at the Ombudsman, and similar in a customer service perspective, where maybe you're dealing with the same goods and services day in, day out, and people experience the same sort of issues. So yeah, okay, that temptation to think, well, I've heard this before, but actually you haven't, because you haven't heard it from that particular individual and you don't understand the impact that it has on them. So making sure we don't find ourselves by our own experience making assumptions and switching off, really, really important. And one of the things that we tend to find at the Ombudsman is sometimes it's not the actual physical issue that somebody has that has incurred. So for example, passenger assist failure with a ramp not deploying correctly and not being able to disembark a train was an incident in itself that was quite distressing for that individual. But actually what compounded the issue was the way that they were dealt through the customer service process, in that they didn't feel listened to. So what drives the complaint through to the escalation point, and actually making sure that your processes have this wherewithal, that you are able to listen and to treat everybody as an individual. Which leads on to the third bullet point there about encouraging flexible, tailored outcomes. So as I've already denoted, the Ombudsman has access to not just legal remedies, but flexible remedies, which are grounded in fairness. So we can make a decision on a case, and a really good example of that in the furniture industry is a store credit for furniture, where there might be an issue with goods. Generally speaking, I've got a chair and there's an issue with that chair. The retailer will come and collect it and potentially give me a full or a refund of some sort. Actually, what that reselection process enables the retailer to do is to leave me with that chair, and that could be important. That could be my main, my main source of seating during the day if I'm in the house on my own potentially, or I need a specific mobility chair or a recliner chair. That could be really important that stays with me while the issue is sorted out, and then I can choose something else that might be better, might be more tailored to my needs, but the business doesn't necessarily come and take that away straight away. Similarly, we encourage the use of loan furniture in those circumstances. So businesses can do things to help their consumers while they sort things out, especially with the supply chain delays that are being faced into at the moment. And then another facet of kind of best practice, if you like, when you're tailoring your processes and thinking about customers, and this is a broad point that can be encompassed within your customer service process, but will really make a difference to people who are anxious, who are vulnerable, who are waiting to hear, especially from an ombudsman's perspective, where we might be their only route to justice in reality, because they won't go to court with their cases. So the penultimate bullet point there is, don't wait for me, be proactive. So are your staff empowered to be forward thinking, to take ownership, to make sure that if they've promised an outcome, they only make promises they can keep and don't break a promise that they have made. So making sure that we are proactive, that we contact people, that we keep them in the loop. It makes you feel far less vulnerable if there's an element of control in what we're doing. So making sure that people understand the process, understand what's happening, and understand what their next steps are is empowering, really important. And then if I need help and you can't help me, that signposting element. Do you know where I could go next? For us, a consumer potentially has got other routes if they don't get the outcome that they want from the Ombudsman process. But do you know where they could go next? And signposting, big discussions around this, and on its own it could be really unhelpful, because you're just passing somebody off somewhere else. Is there an opportunity to do warm transfer? Is there an opportunity to add value to that, to really make sure that people are getting the help that they need? So from an Ombudsman perspective, we've got some examples here from the Ombudsman's casebook about things that we see that particularly affect people who are vulnerable, and I'll run through a couple of these that I haven't already. So I've touched on the practical remedies that we have available to us. So reselection there being an example. Another thing that we face into that businesses need to consider when they are looking at consumers who are vulnerable is where the contract is formed. So, for example, a consumer who enters into a contract in their own home is potentially vulnerable for a couple of reasons. They might be more susceptible to contract because they're relaxed and in their own home environment, or they might be subject to pressure and potential pressure sales, or feel as though they don't quite like what's going on, they don't feel comfortable, but they can't leave because there's somebody else in their home. So dealing with people in their own homes, whether that's a home improvement type contract, or you know, whatever the goods and services are being promoted there, has an element of additional legal protection. So consumers have additional rights. So making sure that businesses are aware of that and the reasons for that, because obviously there are really good reasons for that. Thinking about your contact channels from a customer service perspective, are there any barriers there to people contacting you? Is there anything there that you know, that affects people who are potentially vulnerable? And thinking about the really broad circumstances there, that can encompass so much. So it could be somebody, for example, that doesn't get the same delivery services because of their geographical location. For example, certain islands in Scotland, you know, there is an issue there with people having to pay more potentially for delivery, and they are potentially then vulnerable from a geographical situation. We found in the various lockdowns on the rail networks, people weren't able to travel, weren't able to or go out to their station, and missed out on a certain degree of information that they got visually from things like posters on stations, because they weren't getting that information. So was that presented in a way that met the criteria of somebody who was digitally excluded? So where was that information about how they could get, for example, a season ticket refund? Was it included on the IVR? So if I rang up, I got that information without necessarily having to go online or view a poster at the station where I wasn't supposed to be travelling. So again, customer service and contact channels can be really important, and we do see a number of complaints relating to the accessibility of those. The example I'd like to finish with, though, which I think is quite a useful one, and I'll stop sharing to talk you through this, is the bottom one there on the slide that I've just come off, which is about the young person's train guide. And this is a resource that we pulled together in collaboration with some within the rail company about the use of bylaws. And the reason I want to highlight this is that I think young people travelling on the rail network for the first time, potentially going to school, are vulnerable from that perspective, but they're not always going to be vulnerable in that specific circumstance. So looking here about education and information and communication, I think is really important, because actually what this resource sought to do was to educate young people about a set of bylaws that govern their use of the rail network, whether that be about how they are ticketed, where they're supposed to be, safety concerns, what happens when things go wrong, who they can turn to, and what the processes are, and disseminating that in a way that was understood by them. Actually, it educates them for the longer term as well, because they won't always be vulnerable. And I think this is also a good example of the Ombudsman remit more broadly, because this was brought out of one case, but then several cases that came out of fairly similar circumstances. So in that particular case, the original case, a young person was travelling. There had been ticket machines. There hadn't been ticket machines at the station that they used to travel to and from school. So they always bought their ticket on the train. And then ticket machines were putting at the station without realising. They boarded a train without a ticket, expecting to be able to buy a ticket on the train. Got to the destination station and said, I wasn't able to buy a ticket, can I buy one now? At which point received a penalty fare. So all of that is, it's covered off by the bylaws. You need to travel with a ticket. What information was there about the ticket vending machines? Were they advertised? And it struck us at the Ombudsman that there is a lot of information out there, and this probably goes across absolutely every sector, but there's a lot of information that's there. But is it presented in a way that I will understand it, and that I can appreciate that there are obligations on me as well as on the company. So we put together a resource in collaboration with some within the industry in order to just better explain, by way of kind of fact sheets and blogs, etc. And this was actually picked up by a couple of schools as part of their PHSE curriculum. So it's educating users of the network for their safety and for future. Because actually one of the things that came to light there was that if young people were challenged, there were instances where they'd gone and hidden in the toilets or gone to parts of the station that they weren't supposed to be, which has massive safety implications as well. So there are a number of facets to this. And I think drawing on that from a retail perspective as well, and tying in with it, I know some of the work that that BSI are doing by way of another international standard is terms and conditions more generally, because there are instances where really important information is in terms and conditions that people generally just don't read them, and they're not often, in my experience, presented in a way that makes them particularly user friendly for people to use. So again, that's a really important piece of work about information and making that information accessible, and from an inclusivity perspective, being able to communicate that in a way that resonates with the end user is really, really important, and ties into this very, very important piece of work. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight as to what the Ombudsman does, but also that broader remit that's a really important metric for businesses to be able to take the learnings from their own cases, but also more broadly from what we see across the various sectors. And obviously, as you'll be aware, Ombudsman operate in lots of different sectors over and above the ones that I've highlighted today from my direct experience. But it's about the learning, and that can be really important from an access to justice perspective, from a business perspective, and staff, empowering staff to be able to deal effectively with people, and of course then making sure that policies are inclusive, incorporate all of your potential users, and improve standards for all service users. Okay. So that's the end of my presentation today. I don't know whether there are any questions for me. There's nothing in the chat room. Or in the chats. Nope.
Nobody got anything on the standard 22458? I guess not.
Okay. Well, I mean, if anybody has anything they want to follow up on afterwards, I'm always really, really happy to do that. So if anything occurs to you after, then thank you, Chris. No questions. Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Just follow up afterwards if you want to do that. They have my contact details here.
Okay. I think in that case, then I think we're done. If nobody has anything else, and as Judith said, contact me if you've got anything about the standard and the BSI. Otherwise, that's the end of the session. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, it's a very weird experience talking to an audience that I can't see, but good afternoon, everybody.
I'll put the link in the chat. So if you've got her email, it's easier for you to just send it.
We've got somebody not muted.
Yeah, kids mute.
Oh, there you go. Everybody's muted now.
Okay, we're ready.